Hey guys, tonight we are going to slip quietly into the dim and tangled history of a very real king, Edward II of England, a man whose story is so steeped in passion, betrayal, and scandal that later generations summed it up with the phrase, "the king who died from his own lust." This is not a fairy tale, not an invented parable, but a documented life that unraveled in ways that make Game of Thrones look like a polite tea party. His reign was marked not only by love and loyalty, but also by disastrous favoritism, bitter betrayal, and an ending so infamous that historians still argue whether the most shocking detail is true or just the cruelest medieval rumor ever invented. And yes, before you get too cozy, let me warn you. You probably would not survive long in his court, where whispers could end in execution and affection could topple a throne. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. While you are at it, tell me in the comments where you are listening from, and what time it is for you right now, because I love seeing where in the world these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in the year 1284, within the thick stone walls of Caernarfon Castle in Wales. The fortress is still new, smelling of lime mortar and damp stone, its towers rising sharply over the waters of the River Saône. Inside, a newborn's cries echo faintly in the vaulted chambers, mixing with the low murmur of attendants. That child is Edward of Caernarfon, the boy who will grow to wear England's crown, though at this moment he is nothing more than a swaddled bundle in a cradle carved from oak. His father, Edward I, known as Longshanks for his intimidating height, chose this Welsh stronghold deliberately. He wanted his heir to be born in conquered territory, a symbol that English power would root itself deep into every corner of the island. Imagine the political theatre of it, a baby as a living statement of domination. But the child himself, as you glimpse him through the flicker of torchlight, is not born for stern symbolism. His eyes, when they open, are curious rather than piercing. As he grows into boyhood, he shows a surprising fondness for things no warrior king would value. He enjoys music, theatrics, and the company of friends more than the drill of soldiers. He is as likely to be seen strumming a lute as he is to be watching his father knights practice with swords. There is a softness to him, not weakness exactly, but a warmth that feels out of step with the cold iron discipline of his father's court. You can almost hear the whispers of the nobles already. The boy is not his father. One widely accepted fact about young Edward is his love of outdoor labor, an unusual trait for a prince. He liked digging ditches, roofing houses, and even rowing boats. It might sound like child's play, but this was genuine. Records show he paid peasants to teach him how to thatch roofs and dig properly. Imagine their surprise, a royal heir sweating alongside them, asking questions about mud and straw. Lesser known is his fondness for the company of common workmen. He would eat with them, laugh with them, and later in life, he scandalized courtiers by continuing to prefer the rough humor of laborers over the stiff formality of noble banquets. Historians still debate whether this fascination was an early act of rebellion against aristocratic stiffness, or if he simply enjoyed breaking rules for the sake of being different. As you follow the boy through the halls of the royal palace at Westminster, you hear his father's voice booming down a corridor. Edward I is not a man known for patience. He is broad-shouldered, iron-willed, a veteran of countless campaigns. His temper is sharp, his ambitions sharper. He expects obedience from his son, expects him to carry forward the unyielding tradition of conquest. But the boy is not cut from the same cloth. He prefers laughter to lectures, friendship to fear. The tension between father and son is not yet a fracture, but you sense it forming like a crack beneath the surface of stone. Edward's companions, other boys of noble birth, find him magnetic. He is playful, generous with trinkets and promises, and unlike his father, he listens. There is something dangerously addictive about being the object of a prince's affection, and already Edward has begun to practice the habit that will one day define his reign, picking favorites and showering them with privileges. It seems harmless now, childhood games, shared secrets, laughter in the gardens, but it will grow into a storm that shakes England. By the time Edward is a teenager, Courtiers have noticed his reluctance for traditional knightly pursuits. He can fight, yes, but without the fervor of his father. Instead, he immerses himself in pageantry, festivals, and elaborate entertainments. One open question historians still debate is whether Edward's lack of enthusiasm for war was simple temperament, or whether he was making a quiet statement against the relentless violence of his father's rule. Did he truly despise battle, or did he simply long for joy in a world where joy was considered frivolous? Imagine a hall lit with 100 torches. At the high table sits Edward I, stern and commanding, surrounded by his lords. Down the row, young Edward laughs too loudly at a friend's jest, spilling wine on the table. His father's glance is ice. The boy shrinks slightly, but he does not stop smiling. The contrast is almost theatrical, a king of iron and a son of warmth, locked in a silent, lifelong standoff. And yet, for all his gentle eccentricities, Edward is not without ambition. He begins to show signs of stubbornness, even arrogance when crossed. He might spend afternoons roofing barns with peasants, but if a noble questions his choices, he bristles. He will not be told how to feel, nor who to love. It is a streak of defiance that feels refreshing now, but it will one day become catastrophic. His determination to elevate favorites against the will of his lords will turn England against him. Walking through the palace gardens with him, you notice how he lingers near certain companions longer than others, how his eyes brighten in their company. These are not casual friendships. They are attachments that pulse with intensity. For a boy it is endearing. For a future king it is dangerous. Already you sense the outline of his fate forming, a crown balanced precariously on affection, loyalty measured not in armies but in embraces. The boy who plays with laborers, who strums lutes, who clings fiercely to his friends, will one day become a man undone by those very traits. And as the torches burn low in the hall, as his father's stern shadow looms over him, you cannot help but wonder, can softness survive in a world built on steel, or is Edward already destined for the tragic title history will give him, the king who died from his own lust? You do not really have to wait very long before the name Piers Gaveston starts floating into your ears like a melody that refuses to leave, and in truth it arrives into Edward's life with the force of a storm disguised as charm, because while you are still standing near the boy prince, trying to puzzle out his half-built towers of hobby and his strange habit of digging trenches for fun, there suddenly appears this Gascon knight, whose very presence seems designed to sparkle, as though the universe created him for no other purpose than to lean on a sword hilt, with insufferable grace, grin at a room full of hostile barons, and make Edward laugh in a way that nobody else quite can. And from the very beginning you feel a certain electricity in the air, the sort of voltage that does not politely knock on the door, but instead kicks it open and waltzes in uninvited, announcing that things are never going to be the same again. You watch Edward watching him, and it is not the quiet admiration a prince gives to a loyal servant, nor is it the stern glance of a master toward a subordinate. It is something far more volatile, a mixture of fascination and recognition, as though Edward has discovered a mirror that reflects not his face, but the more daring version of himself he secretly longs to be. And in Piers Gaveston's jokes, in his irreverent way of treating pompous nobles as if they are merely badly dressed actors on a stage, Edward finds the kind of companionship he has been craving. The connection is immediate, undeniable, and frankly a little dangerous because, while history gives you many examples of rulers who surrounded themselves with clever favorites, very few of them dared to show their affection so openly. And Edward is not a subtle man when it comes to emotions, so soon enough people begin whispering, then muttering, and eventually shouting about how this Gascon interloper is worming his way into the prince's heart. But before we leap ahead to angry parliaments and baronial conspiracies, you should savor the small ridiculous details of their friendship. The way Edward delights in giving Piers absurdly extravagant gifts, including the title of Earl of Cornwall, which is roughly the medieval equivalent of handing your buddy the keys to your nation's luxury penthouse, while muttering nobles fume into their wine goblets. The way the two of them strut about tournaments like a pair of mischievous schoolboys who somehow got hold of an entire armory, and the way Piers's sharp tongue can cut through the stiffest silence in court, provoking both laughter and fury often in the same sentence. And here is your first official fact to pin on the wall like a souvenir. Edward did indeed elevate Gaveston to Earl of Cornwall in 1307, a move that scandalized the nobility, because that title had always been reserved for members of the royal family, not for cheeky knights from Gascony who made jokes at banquets. And your quirky, lesser-known tidbit, which makes the whole relationship sound even more like a bizarre sitcom, is that Edward once gave Piers a set of royal jewelry, so ornate and feminine, that chroniclers wrote about it with barely disguised contempt, describing how Gaveston strutted about in pearls and embroidered silks that would have made any princess jealous, so you can imagine the older lords clutching their prayer beads while muttering that the realm was surely doomed if this was the new model of masculinity. Yet the open debate that historians still argue about is whether Edward E's passion for Gaveston was purely romantic, or whether it was primarily political, with some scholars insisting that Edward admired Gaveston less as a lover and more as a daring partner in defiance against an aristocracy that always treated him as inferior to his father. But the truth is probably tangled in the middle, because when you look into Edward's eyes in this story, you see both rebellion and infatuation, both strategy and sincerity, and it is precisely that blur which makes the whole affair so combustible. And if you are wondering why this friendship matters so much, remember that in medieval courts, power was not just about armies and taxes. It was about intimacy, about who could whisper into a king's ear when the candle burned low, about who shared the private jokes that softened the weight of a crown. And by giving that position to Gaveston, Edward was essentially telling the rest of England's nobility that their approval no longer mattered, that their centuries of entitlement could be outshone by one man's ability to make him feel alive. You can almost hear the gnashing of teeth echoing through stone halls as older barons mutter about honor and tradition, and you might chuckle a little at the thought that what truly terrified them was not simply Gaveston's cheek, but the realization that Edward would never play by their rules, that he would happily rewrite the script of kingship with sarcasm and affection rather than solemnity and blood. And yet, as charming as it all sounds, when you are sitting here with dim lights and a soft hum of the fan, there is an ominous shadow creeping across the scene, because you know the nobles will not let this stand forever, and while Edward is busy daydreaming about tournaments and laughter, and while Piers Gaveston is polishing another string of borrowed jewels somewhere in the distance, the knives of politics are already being sharpened. You barely have time to settle into the glitter of Piers Gaveston's pearls before the sound of grumbling grows too loud to ignore a low thunder that rolls through baronial halls and echoes against the stone vaults of Westminster. And you feel the temperature in the realm drop because nothing chills a court faster than a clique of angry nobles who believe their dignity has been trampled. And make no mistake, they absolutely believe that is what Edward has done, for every gift he gives Gaveston is taken as an insult to their birthright. Every laugh they share at tournaments is heard as mockery of their traditions, and the title of Earl of Cornwall feels to them like a slap across the face. You watch as they gather in clusters, these magnates with their fur collars and their perpetual scowls, their rings heavy with centuries of inherited arrogance, and you notice how their conversations spiral again and again to the same name, Gaveston. Gaveston, as though he is a curse or a disease spreading through the veins of the kingdom, and it is almost comical how little attention they pay to the actual governance of England when there is a scandal to brood over. But their anger is not a passing mood. It is a smouldering coal that will soon set fire to everything. They decide, of course, that the prince is being bewitched, that no sensible man would shower so much favor on a Gascon knight unless some kind of sorcery or sin is involved, and the whispers grow darker, full of insinuations about what happens in private chambers. And here you must pause and acknowledge one fact. Edward did marry Isabella of France in 1308, a political alliance that should have cemented peace between England and France, but instead it became another stage for the Gaveston drama, because Edward apparently left Isabella at her own coronation banquet to sit beside Piers instead, which is rather like abandoning your bride at the altar to play video games with your best friend. And the scandal was so intense that even the French delegation muttered about sending her back home. The quirky little detail that makes you raise an eyebrow is that Gaveston had a habit of giving the barons insulting nicknames, calling one of them the Black Dog of Arden and mocking others with labels sharp enough to sting. And if you think nobles do not hold grudges, imagine a high school cafeteria but with swords and armies attached, and you will understand why his witty tongue was a death sentence. And the open question that still divides historians is whether Edward truly believed he could tame his nobles by sheer force of stubborn affection, or whether he underestimated them completely, because there is a difference between defying your elders at dinner and defying men who command entire armies. And Edward seemed to conflate the two as if the barons were merely sulking uncles rather than dangerous rivals. Soon their frustration turns into action, and they draft ordinances meant to curb royal power, demanding that Gaveston be exiled not once but multiple times, and though Edward dutifully sends him away in appearance, you can almost see the wink and nod behind it, for Gaveston keeps finding his way back like a boomerang no one asked for, slipping across the channel with fresh gifts and renewed titles, each return stoking the noble's rage to boiling. You walk beside Edward in these years, and you feel the tug-of-war between crown and barons stretch tighter with each month. And what is striking is not only the political drama, but the emotional drama, because Edward seems unable to imagine a world without Gaveston, as though every exile is not a punishment to his favorite, but a punishment to himself. And you begin to realize that this is the true tragedy brewing here, that a king who might have ruled peacefully is choosing to gamble everything on the laughter of one man. You see Parliament halls packed with men demanding reform. You hear Latin scribbled into charters, declaring new limits on royal excess. You smell the sweat of tense negotiations where Gaveston's name is spat like poison, and all the while Edward clings harder, defiantly parading his affection in public, as though daring anyone to stop him. And the thing is, someone will, because no political system can endure a monarch who so openly flaunts the balance of power. And while you may admire Edward's loyalty on some late night when you are curled under a blanket, listening to this story, you also know that it is loyalty wielded like a blade against the wrong people, and it is only a matter of time before the blade is turned back on him. So when the Parliament grumbles turn into written decrees, and the Lords force Edward's hand, you find yourself trudging to the edge of the channel watching Piers Gaveston ride away for the first time, his horse kicking up salt-laced sand as if the very sea itself is sulking. And you feel the King-S mood sour like a spoiled cask of wine, because although Edward nods along to the exile in public, in private, he is already plotting the reunion, and soon the exile becomes a farce that everyone knows but no one can stop. A drama stage between crown and baron, full of whispered schemes and theatrical returns. You are in the corridors when Gaveston slips back into the court, not creeping like a thief, but swaggering like a man who believes the world owes him a laugh. He returns with more jewels, more insolence, and a grin so audacious that even the tapestries seem to bristle, and the scene feels at once ridiculous and dangerously theatrical. Gaveston struts through one great hall while a cluster of noblemen mutter in another, and you can picture 1,000 simmering pots of resentment set on a slow boil. One solid fact to hold on to is that the barons did force the ordinances of 1311, a formal attempt to clip royal power and specifically to curb the influence of the King's favourites, which included explicit demands that Gaveston be removed from court. Yet you watch and wonder as if signatures on parchment are faint echoes compared to the thunder of affection and habit, because Edward behaves as though the ordinances are mere props in a play he cannot or will not exit. There is a small, almost absurd detail that keeps resurfacing in the chronicles. Gaveston loved nicknames and mockery, and he delighted in giving the High Lords humiliating sobriquets that stuck like burrs, black dog, mole, and other slights, so that every insult could be counted like tally marks on a grievance list. The sort of pettiness that, when combined with high politics, becomes combustible. And historians still debate whether Edward's repeated favoritisms were acts of love, rebellion, or deliberate politics. And you feel the tug of each possibility as you stand in the middle of staterooms that smell of wax and old leather. Was he tenderly devoted, petulantly defiant, or simply politically tone-deaf? The answer wavers like a candle flame. When Gaveston returns, it is not to a hero's welcome, but to a city on edge. And you move through London, whose narrow streets, and you feel the tension like a change in weather. The sky looks lower, conversations are clipped, and even the dogs seem to walk with more dignity than the courtiers who once mocked Gaveston. Edward, though, is blithe to the danger. He treats each homecoming as if the Baron's anger were a mere annoyance, a rainy day to be ignored. And there is a private theatre inside the palace where the king and his favourite rehearse their companionship, jokes, shared bottles, and conspicuous tenderness. And you watch it with a mixture of amusement and rising alarm, because affection in the royal bedchamber is not a private thing. It is policy with embroidery. Gaveston's sly behaviour makes him both adorable and infuriating. He wears outrageous clothes, he taunts lords with a wink, and he seems to believe himself untouchable, as if the crown-heir shadow on his shoulder is an invisible suit of armour. You cannot help but smirk at his audacity. If arrogance had a smell, it would be Gaveston's signature scent. Yet the smirk sours as one insult mounts on another until the lords of patience shatters. Remember the texture of the land at this time. Muddy fields, narrow causeways, and inns, where gossip tastes as strong as the ale. You follow the fugitives as Edward and Gaveston flee on horseback, the wind biting their faces, banners snapping like angry birds, and you can feel the breath of pursuit at their backs, because the barons do not merely grumble in halls. They take up arms, practical and cruel, and they corner Gaveston in 1312 near Blacklow Hill by Warwick, an accepted date and place in the chronicles. And you stand with the crowd as the thunder of judgment rings in daylight, for what had been a courtly scandal has become in the baron's eyes a political solution. The record is stark and sharp. Piers Gaveston is seized and executed by the very nobles he mocked, men who tell themselves they restored balance to a kingdom, and the actual moment is colder than rumour, and more symbolic than any chronicle could simply state. The man who laughed at lords now lies silent, and every laugh that once buoyed Edward's spirits is a pebble that starts an avalanche. You smell the iron in the air, you hear the scrape of rope and leather. You sense grief arriving in Edward like a physical wound, not only because he loved Gaveston, but because the death removes the person who had been his anchor against loneliness and courtly hypocrisy. Grief changes Edward's shape. It does not make him sharper or wiser, but heavier with it, as though sorrow were a garment he cannot remove, and that sorrow nudges him toward a pattern that will be both his comfort and his curse. He will replace the void with another favourite someone who will not be content with jokes and glitter, but will stake a claim for power itself. If Gaveston's fall felt like a temporary triumph for certain barons, the longer view is less triumphant. The execution solves nothing, and instead seeds a rot in the crown, and the choice Edward makes afterward, indeed the choice he repeats, will be a stubborn refusal to negotiate with those who wield force. You walk with him through late nights, where the candle sputters and the court's laughter has thinned. You see his eyes burn with a coal that will not go out, and you realize that the removal of one favorite has taught him a dangerous lesson. Attachment may be costly, yes, but abandoning attachment seems to him costlier still. In the hours and days that follow, the court behaves not like a single organism, but like a broken clock, each piece moving to its own contradictory tune. Some lords congratulate one another with thinly veiled smiles, while others sit in private chambers staring into embers as if fire could unmake the act. You feel the country split in small practical ways, the reassignment of offices, the clink of coin as estates change hands, the shuffling of legal papers that will seed resentments for years. Because violence may solve a scandal in theory, but it rearranges power in ways that ripple down to markets and hearths. Edward's reaction is not a single cinematic outburst, but a collage of smaller torments. Nights of sleepless pacing, letters he writes in fury that never reach their destination, private audiences where he grips a goblet until the metal sings, and there is perversely a jagged humor to his stubbornness. He behaves like someone insisting on hugging a thorny branch because it is the only branch left. Yet the image is bitter rather than comforting. Ordinary people speak of Gaveston in a mixed voice. Tavern songs will remember his jokes and style, while farmers quietly count losses from confiscated lands and rising levies. A reminder that while the nobles fight over honor, ordinary life measures cost in coin and bread. The chroniclers who survive will each bend the story to suit alliances, and historians still puzzle over which accounts reflect sorrow which reflect political spinning, and which reflect opportunistic embellishment. For you standing in the corridors of power, the lesson is cruelly simple. Executing a favorite does not heal a kingdom. It leaves fissures and sends the ruler searching for new refuges, new loyalties to tether himself to. And those new loyalties will be the very tinder that invites a second fire. The quiet after the storm is deceptive. It is the hush before a larger noise, and you sense the next act already assembling its props and players. You have seen the void Gaveston's death left in Edward's chest, and you have watched him stumble toward the arms of new companions. But the one figure who cannot be ignored, who moves like a shadow through the very architecture of this drama, is Isabella, Queen of England, daughter of the French king, married to Edward since she was a girl of 12, and now by her 20s, sharpened by years of court politics, suspicion, and disappointment. You walk with her through chambers hung with French silks, where she practices the art of being overlooked and underestimated, the way some women practice embroidery, and you sense the quiet rage that pools beneath her calm eyes. She has endured much, Gaveston's flaunted intimacy, the court's whispers, and now the new presence of Hugh Despenser, who has entered the stage like a hawk among pigeons, his talons not only for Edward's affection, but for land titles and the very marrow of royal authority. Isabella does not shriek or storm as the caricature of a jealous wife might. Instead, she calculates like a chess player staring at a crowded board. You sit beside her as she watches Despenser coil himself around the king, offering counsel. With a smile too polished, taking lands through legal acrobatics and insulting magnates with the smoothness of someone who has already measured the cost of their hatred. The sensory texture of this period is not the clatter of swords, but the scratch of quills, the hiss of wax seals, the dry shuffle of parchment, because Despenser knows power lives as much in documents as in spears, and he gathers property like a miser gathers coins, until whole swathes of England bow not to the crown but to him. You catch the scent of resentment in the corridors, sharper than lamp oil, because nobles are not merely annoyed, they are dispossessed, and dispossession is a wound that festers. It is here that Isabella's role begins to shift. Once, she had been a partner in ceremony, a figure to drape the king with legitimacy, but now she becomes something else, the eye that notices everything. She writes letters to her French kin, she negotiates, she gathers quiet sympathies. You stand behind her as she plays her role with outward obedience, accompanying Edward to public masses and festivals, but each gesture conceals a steelier truth. She knows that Despenser is the new Gaveston, yet worse, because Gaveston sought laughter and favor, while Despenser seeks dominion. And here lies a fact historians agree upon. Isabella's personal lands, granted to her as queen, were confiscated by Despenser's maneuvering, leaving her financially humiliated in a way that was both deliberate and symbolic. To seize a queen's dower is not merely greed, it is insult, and insult becomes tinder when it is repeated in private. You might laugh bitterly at the irony. Edward, who had seen one kingdom shaken by his infatuation, seems determined to repeat the same script with a harsher actor. It is as though he cannot resist turning life into farce, even when the first act ended in tragedy. One chronicler even recorded that Edward loved Despenser beyond measure and reason, which is either a scandalous exaggeration or a precise diagnosis, depending on whether you take your history like dry bread or like spiced wine. And the open question, the one scholars still chew on like gristle, is whether Edward's devotion was truly romantic, as with Gaveston, or whether Despenser's attraction lay in his ability to dominate, to control, to offer the king the illusion of strength in a world that mocked him. You feel the ambiguity every time you see Edward lean close to him in council, a look of need that could be affection or fear, or both at once. The kingdom reacts as kingdoms do, by fracturing. Marcher lords along the Welsh borders rise against Despenser, their complaints as much about confiscated lands as about dishonor. The opposition swells into open revolt by 1321, and you find yourself on horseback again, the smell of wet earth clinging to your cloak, as banners gather not in celebration, but in defiance. The Despenser War, as it is later called, is less a single clash than a series of sparks that spread too quickly for Edward to stamp out. And yet Edward clings to Hugh with the desperation of a drowning man clutching driftwood. He refuses compromise, refuses to exile his new favorite, and instead launches himself into battle with a vigor born not of strategy, but of stubborn devotion. You ride beside the rebels as they burn Despenser's lands, watching smoke coil into the sky like accusations written in fire. You hear the laughter of men drunk on sudden justice, though justice here is indistinguishable from vengeance. And when the barons force Edward to exile Despenser in August of 1321, you stand in Westminster and feel the tremor of déjà vu. How many times must the play repeat? But unlike Gaveston, Despenser will not stay gone. Edward brings him back within months, and this time the king's vengeance is merciless. By the end of 1322, after crushing the rebels at Boroughbridge, Edward orchestrates the execution of his cousin Thomas of Lancaster, once the leader of opposition, beheading him in public and confiscating his estates. The air at that execution smells of iron and damp wool, the crowd a mixture of silence and uneasy murmurs, because everyone knows that killing Lancaster is not merely justice, it is revenge, raw and unashamed. The joke, if you can stomach one, is that Edward has finally shown the steel his critics always accused him of lacking, but only in defense of a favorite who bleeds his kingdom dry. It is as if he has discovered a new talent for cruelty, and he uses it to protect a man whose ambition makes Gaveston look like a mischievous page boy. Hugh Despenser does not merely bask in Edward's affection, he becomes a second monarch in all but name. He controls access to the king, monopolizes royal patronage, and even oversees judicial sentences, twisting justice like wax in the sun. You, watching from the back of the hall, almost expect someone to announce that England now has two kings, one crowned and one coiled like ivy around the throne. And Isabella? She endures, but endurance has an end. You can feel the point at which humiliation hardens into resolve. In 1325, Edward sends her to France to negotiate with her brother, Charles IV, over the thorny issue of Gascony. The official mission is diplomacy, but the real outcome is defection. Isabella refuses to return, aligning herself with the exiled Roger Mortimer, a lord who had fled Edward's wrath and now shares Isabella's bed and cause. The open debate that lingers among historians, was this alliance purely political at first, or did passion lead politics by the nose, is less important than the fact that you can see her transformation. The girl who once played the dutiful queen now writes letters calling Edward a tyrant and speaks openly of his destruction. You watch her in the French court, her voice calm, her bearing regal, and you realize she has become what Edward never truly managed to be, a ruler who understands both patience and timing. The air of 1326 is thick with foreboding. Isabella and Mortimer gather an invasion force not vast but sharp, and their arrival in England is less like a storm than like a knife slipped between ribs, sudden, precise, fatal. You walk with them through cheering towns where resentment against Despenser has fermented for years, and you feel the momentum swing as if the entire kingdom has been holding its breath. Edward flees with Despenser, the two of them scrambling westward, hunted men rather than sovereigns. You catch the smell of panic in the damp autumn air, hear the frantic hooves on muddy roads, and see the once proud pair reduced to fugitives. Isabella's triumph is cold, not hot. When Despenser is captured, his fate is brutal. Hanged, drawn, and quartered in the winter of 1326, his body parts sent to the corners of the realm as if to scatter the infection he represented. You stand in the crowd and watch, and even as your stomach churns at the gore, you sense the catharsis of a people finally unburdened. Edward, meanwhile, is captured, imprisoned, and stripped of his crown in January 1327, the first English king formally deposed by Parliament. The very air in the hall smells of dust and ink, as the document of abdication is read aloud, and you feel the weight of centuries shift. Isabella's victory tastes of ash, for she must still manage the kingdom, and Edward's presence even in prison is a danger. And here the tale slides toward its dark, infamous climax, one whispered in chronicles with both relish and horror, that Edward was murdered in Berkeley Castle, possibly by the grotesque method of a red-hot poker inserted into his body, a punishment chosen not merely for death, but for symbolic humiliation of lust. Modern historians argue fiercely about this, Some say it is lurid propaganda, others that it is entirely plausible, still others that he died quietly of neglect or illness. You, standing in the cold corridors of Berkeley, cannot know which truth is real, only that the silence is heavy, the torches smoke in the damp air, and the legend has become inseparable from the man. And you realize that Isabella, in turning from patient queen to avenging rebel, has shaped the story as much as Edward's lust ever did. If Edward clung to dispenser with blind devotion, Isabella clung to survival with razor-edged clarity. The clash between those two forms of loyalty, personal passion and political necessity, has brought a kingdom to the edge and dragged it over. And you, walking through the aftermath, feel that strange mixture of awe and exhaustion that follows every downfall. The sense that history is both vast and small, written in both treaties and tears, parchment and flesh. The walls of Berkeley Castle close around you like damp stone lungs. The corridors narrow, the air heavy with the smell of moss and iron, and it is here that Edward, once crowned King of England, is reduced to a prisoner whose world has shrunk to a few chambers and a scattering of indifferent guards. You walk beside him in these final months, watching the strange transformation that comes when a man who once commanded armies and courts must now negotiate with shadows, silence, and the dripping of water down a cold wall. His captors keep him alive but not comfortable. Food coarse, wine thin, straw bedding stale. You see him hair tangled, garments worn, pacing with the restlessness of someone who still half believes rescue might come thundering down the road. He does not believe himself finished, not yet, because kings are not raised to imagine endings, and in that delusion there is both a fragile dignity and a tragic blindness. You lean against the stone and wonder, as many historians have, whether Edward truly grasped the gravity of his deposition. Was he waiting for Isabella to relent, for Mortimer to overreach, for nobles to grow weary of their rebellion? Or did he, even in his imprisonment, cling to the notion that his story could not possibly end in darkness, because kings always believed themselves woven into some divine tapestry that no knife could cut? The fact is, Edward's fate was sealed not by any lingering affection from the realm, but by his very existence. A deposed king is a living beacon of instability. As long as Edward breathed, he remained a rallying point for discontent, and Isabella and Mortimer, for all their triumph, knew this. You see it in their hurried counsels, in the muttered worries about loyalist plots, in the way messages are intercepted, and men hanged simply for writing of hope. To govern with a captive king alive is to govern in fear, and fear pushes rulers toward the one solution that history repeats with grim regularity: eliminate the danger. It is here that the story shifts into the mist of legend, because though chronicles agree Edward died in September 1327, the method remains the subject of endless speculation, and you, standing at his side in the dank chamber, can hear the uncertainty echoing across centuries. One version whispers of suffocation, quiet, almost merciful by medieval standards. Another insists poison found its way into his food, invisible, untraceable, though not exactly subtle, since prisoners had a habit of noticing sudden illness. But the tale that has burned itself into imagination, the one schoolchildren giggle about and historians frown over, is the infamous poker. You feel the heat of it described, a red-hot iron inserted into his body so that no mark would show outwardly, a punishment chosen as if the universe itself had a twisted sense of irony punishing his lust with a weapon of lust. Chroniclers, some writing decades later, recorded it with relish, as though they could not resist turning political assassination into morality play. And here lies the debate. Did this grotesque act truly happen, or was it propaganda so effective it outlived the truth? Historians remain divided, some calling it sheer invention, others pointing to the persistence of the detail across multiple accounts. You, in the quiet of the castle, cannot tell whether the air is heavy with smoke from a fire preparing such a tool, or whether it is only the damp chill of rumor seeping into stone. It is strangely human, even in such darkness, that humor clings like a weed in cracks. One chronicler, perhaps with more imagination than restraint, claimed the guards chose this method precisely to leave no external trace, which would have been a clever plan had they not then told half the kingdom about it. It is almost laughable, a murder staged to be secret, then advertised with theatrical flourish. You picture some medieval gossip leaning over an ale bench, eyes wide, describing it in lurid detail, while his companion nods solemnly as if he had been there. You smirk despite yourself, because rumor in the Middle Ages traveled faster than horses, carried not by speed but by hunger for stories that could turn power into farce. And Edward's end, true or embellished, became a story too irresistible to die. The quirky detail that lingers in these accounts is that Edwardiese keepers were supposedly musicians by day, disguising the sounds of their grim work with the strains of loud instruments so no one would hear his cries. Imagine the macabre absurdity of it. A flute trilling while a king is murdered, a drumbeat covering pain, a lute strumming the soundtrack of an ending. Whether this detail is fact or invention, it carries the bizarre flavor of medieval storytelling, where even tragedy had to be dressed in metaphor. And kings did not simply die. They died in ways that explained, punished, or symbolized their failings. You lean against the wall of Berkeley and listen hard, half expecting to hear the faint notes of music beneath the heavy silence, as if history itself still tries to disguise its own brutality. And yet, despite the grotesque rumors, there is another school of thought, one that suggests Edward may not have died in 1327 at all. Some documents, notably a letter from a Lombard banker, hinted he was still alive years later, smuggled abroad into comfortable obscurity. The so-called Fieschi letter describes him living in Italy, a dethroned monarch turned anonymous wanderer. Most historians dismiss it as a forgery or a convenient political tale, but the possibility lingers like a draft in the corridor. What if Edward, broken but breathing, lived out his days in exile, a ghost of royalty, who might have walked through crowded markets unrecognized? The open question fuels centuries of speculation, because the absence of certainty is more fertile than certainty itself. You find yourself imagining Edward cloaked in anonymity, staring at mountains instead of crowns, perhaps free in ways he never was in Westminster Hall. What is not debated is Isabella and Mortimer's role in orchestrating his removal. They claimed regency for the young Edward III, ruling in his name, and in the first flush of triumph it seemed the realm would accept their arrangement. But power acquired by rebellion and cemented by murder is fragile. Already whispers grew. Isabella's affection for Mortimer scandalized nobles, their extravagance drained the treasury, their arrogance alienated allies. You can feel the irony coil back on itself like a snake. Edward had lost his throne clinging to a favorite, and now Isabella risked hers for the same reason. The difference, perhaps, is that she understood politics better than Edward ever did, though even her cunning could not forever silence suspicion. In the castle's silence, you feel the weight of a broader truth pressing in. Edward's reign was not simply the tragedy of a man undone by love or lust. It was the story of how personal passion collides with political expectation, and how medieval kingship, so wrapped in ceremony and divine authority, could still be shattered by very human weakness. The candles gutter, shadows stretch long across the chamber, and you realize you have walked with Edward from crown to cell, from pomp to whispers, and the story is not yet finished, because history rarely closes cleanly. His death, whether by poker, poison, or exile, is less important than what it unleashed. The rise of Isabella, the revenge of Mortimer, and eventually the return of power to young Edward III, who would grow into the sort of ruler his father never managed to be. And as you step out into the damp night air beyond Berkeley's walls, you taste the cold mist on your lips and hear the slow turning of history's wheel, grinding down kings and favorites alike, relentless, indifferent, and yet somehow darkly theatrical, as though the universe itself could not resist a scandalous ending. Edward's response to this latest wave of humiliation is not quiet, not thoughtful, not even particularly cautious. It is immediate and furious, a blaze that refuses to admit it is standing in a rainstorm. He reaches for Hugh Despenser the Younger, elevating him with the kind of speed that makes onlookers whisper, as though they have just witnessed a sleight of hand. You cannot miss the irony. Edward has just been burned, fatally in the eyes of his critics, for the excessive devotion to one favorite. and his solution is to pour all of his remaining energy into another. The court shifts uneasily, like a row of chairs on an uneven floor. Everyone knows how the last song ended, yet here is the king queuing up the same tune again. Despenser himself is no mere shadow of Gaveston. He is sharper, harder, less flamboyant in his charm, and more direct in his ambition. Where Gaveston played at being dazzling, Despenser sharpens his smile like a blade, and it cuts. His rise is meteoric, lands, titles, influence, all drawn toward him as if Edward is a lodestone and Despenser is pure iron. You, observing this tilt, feel the temperature in the realm change, a subtle but unmissable draft that suggests storms gathering on the horizon. At feasts, Despenser does not perform in the way Gaveston once did. No theatrical flourishes, no ostentatious displays of color. Instead, he dominates conversation with a kind of relentless certainty, as though every topic from war strategy to the proper way to salt fish should end with his voice being the last word. The king's gaze never strays far from him. Where Gaveston had drawn affection, Despenser draws a darker energy, an almost possessive dependence that makes courtiers lean away slightly as if proximity might scorch them. The joke, whispered in back corridors, is that Edward has not replaced his favorite but replaced his leash, willingly fastening himself to a man who knows exactly how to tug. There are quieter moments, too, glimpsed between grand gestures. Edward leaning close as if for reassurance, Despenser accepting the intimacy without embarrassment, a silent pact that seems to grow more binding with each exchange of power and privilege. The air feels thicker around them, as if loyalty itself is being taxed. What historians agree on, broadly speaking, is that Despenser's influence became absolute, stretching into every cranny of political life. He claimed estates confiscated from others, he punished rivals with relentless efficiency, and he made enemies at a rate that would impress even the most reckless gambler. A widely accepted fact is that Despenser's greed was so blatant it nearly broke the spine of Edward's already fragile support among the nobility. But the lesser-known detail is the peculiar intimacy of their political alignment. Despenser and Edward worked almost as if they shared one mind, issuing decrees and judgments that felt like the product of a single, fused will. To the outside observer, this was less a king guided by a counselor, and more a pair of conspirators ruling together, their personal bond bleeding into the mechanics of governance. That intimacy terrified their enemies far more than Gaveston's flamboyant antics ever did. Gaveston had been a threat to pride. Despenser was a threat to survival. It is difficult to resist inserting humor here, because on some level the pattern is absurd. Imagine a monarch repeatedly sticking his hand into the same thorn bush, insisting that this time the thorns will have learned their lesson and chosen to become flowers. Yet there is a tragic undertone beneath the comedy. Edward is not entirely blind. He knows he is mocked, knows he is weakened, knows that his kingdom is an anvil being beaten by the hammer of discontent. And yet, he clings to Despenser because in that bond he finds a rare sense of certainty, of control, of being less alone. You can almost sympathize until you realize that sympathy is no comfort to the people losing land, wealth, and security under Despenser's voracious grasp. The open question historians still debate is the exact nature of Edward and Despenser's bond. Was it love in the romantic sense, a partnership as scandalous as whispers claimed? Or was it an alliance of dependency and ambition, where Edward needed devotion and Despenser needed power, and together they forged something that looked and felt like intimacy, but was in fact mutual necessity? The chroniclers, often prone to exaggeration, tilt in all directions. Some present them as inseparable lovers, others as co-conspirators, still others as king and parasite. The truth, as usual, refuses to sit neatly in any one category. For you, wandering these corridors and listening to the rustle of discontent as nobles grumble behind closed doors, the effect is undeniable. The realm feels tight, brittle, like glass under pressure. The king walks taller in Despenser's shadow, yet every step they take together leaves cracks behind them. The memory of Gaveston still hangs in the air like smoke that refuses to leave a room, and now that smoke mixes with the scent of something sharper, something more acrid. You know the kingdom is moving not toward stability, but toward a sharper breaking point. You feel it in the silence after Despenser enters a hall, in the way courtiers drop their gaze when Edward passes, in the growing weight of tension pressing down on the castle itself. And as night falls across these uneasy halls, you find yourself wondering, not if it will all come undone, but when. You move forward through the narrowing corridors of Edward's story, the torchlight flickering lower, as though history itself is running out of patience with him. The air is heavy with the weight of choices made and consequences avoided for too long, and by now you sense the inevitable. The man who once wore England's crown is cornered, his strength tested not on the battlefield, but in the fragile loyalties of those around him. The court has become a place where whispers travel faster than horse messengers, and every gaze carries judgment. You are there, standing near a tapestry that smells faintly of mildew, watching Edward pace with restless energy, unable to understand how a throne built on divine right could feel so rickety beneath him. He still tries to smile, still clings to ceremony, but the cracks are widening. It is not one dramatic collapse, but a slow leaking of power, like a bucket losing water drip by drip, until the bottom is dry and useless. Edward's world has shrunk to a tangle of alliances that look solid until touched, and then dissolve into betrayal. His closest bond, Hugh Despenser the Younger, clings to him fiercely, whispering strategies, promising vengeance against every noble who mutters against the crown. Despenser, with his hawk-like eyes and lean ambition, is the shadow glued to Edward's side, a man who insists that he can keep the walls upright if only Edward listens closely enough. But in truth, Despenser is less a fortress and more a match tossed near gunpowder. His greed, his cruelty, his endless hunger for land and titles have earned him enemies across every county. To follow him is to invite danger, yet Edward cannot let go. It is less love now than dependence, the way a drowning man might cling not to a life raft, but to another drowning man, insisting that together they can still float. You notice how the nobles grow colder in their greetings, their bows performed with stiff shoulders, their faces set with politeness so sharp it could slice bread. They tolerate Edward, but they do not trust him, and many quietly dream of a different ruler, someone steady, someone less consumed by personal affection. When Isabella, Edward's queen, returns from her diplomatic visit to France, the air shifts even more dramatically. She is no longer the sidelined wife watching her husband favor others. She is composed, radiant in her poise, and carrying with her a quiet confidence that unsettles those who thought she would remain in the shadows forever. You see her glide through the hall in a gown that rustles like whispers themselves, and though her smile is warm, her eyes flicker with something sharper, something that suggests she has grown tired of waiting for her husband to choose her over Despenser. It is almost comic in a dark way, the way Edward fails to read the room. He continues to celebrate small feasts, his musicians plucking out cheerful tunes, his cooks serving roasted meats dripping with fat, as though he can feed loyalty back into the nobles with gravy and wine. You stand in the hall, the scent of rosemary and smoke clinging to your hair, and you cannot help but think it feels like a dinner party on the deck of a ship that has already struck an iceberg. Everyone is politely chewing while glancing at the lifeboats. Edward, meanwhile, makes toasts, his voice bright and oddly boyish for a man of his age, as if the act of raising a cup could undo years of resentment. It does not work, of course. His smile does not patch the leaks. The nobles drink because it is expected, not because they are loyal, and when the cups are set down, the plotting resumes quietly in corners. There is a detail historians sometimes point out, almost with a raised eyebrow. Isabella began to dress more richly upon her return, her jewels catching torchlight in deliberate ways, her gestures more pronounced. Was this vanity, or a calculated move to remind everyone that she carried royal blood of her own, as a daughter of the French king? Historians still wonder if she had already made contact with Roger Mortimer before her return, or if the spark ignited only after she realized just how far Edward had drifted from her. Mortimer was the kind of man who understood power not as ceremony, but as opportunity. He could see a crumbling wall and imagine how to push just hard enough to bring it down. Whether Isabella saw him first as an ally or as something more personal, the outcome was the same. She no longer intended to be a background figure in Edward's story. She was writing her own chapter now, pen dipped in quiet rebellion. The tension builds not with a sudden crash, but with long, drawn-out silences. Edward issues orders, but some of them are ignored. He demands troops, but only half arrive. He insists upon Despenser's safety, and yet assassination attempts ripple through the court with frightening regularity. You are there on a night when a messenger arrives breathless, mud on his boots, announcing another rebellion stirring in the west. Edward clutches at the parchment, his hands shaking, the ink smearing as he presses too hard. He blames Isabella. He blames Mortimer. He blames anyone but himself. The irony is painful. The king, chosen by God in theory, cannot seem to choose a path that leads anywhere but deeper into the thorns. Still, there are moments of almost surreal comedy. Edward, convinced that pageantry will win hearts, orders an elaborate tournament, complete with banners, music, and knights showing off their jousting skills. The crowd cheers, partly for the sport, partly for the roasted chestnuts sold along the sidelines, and you can almost believe, for a fleeting hour, that the kingdom is stable. But then you hear the laughter shift, less with joy and more with mockery. People whisper that while the king hosts games, his nobles plan war. It is like watching someone rearrange flowers in a vase while the house burns down. The smell of horse sweat and trampled grass lingers in your nose as you realize the absurdity of it all. A king tries to prove his power with parades, while his queen quietly recruits allies who will one day topple him. The air in the castle grows colder, though the fires are kept blazing. Edward becomes more paranoid, surrounding himself with guards, locking doors at night, sleeping uneasily with one eye open. Despenser grows harsher, exacting revenge on anyone suspected of treason, confiscating lands, and turning cruelty into policy. You can feel the unease ripple through the servants as they carry trays of food into council chambers where the arguments grow louder, their own faces pale with fear that a spilled goblet could lead to accusations. The atmosphere is heavy, oppressive, and yet strangely fragile, like glass stretched too thin. One sharp tap, you sense, and the whole thing will shatter, and shatter it does. Isabella and Mortimer's alliance blooms in secret, nurtured by letters carried across borders, by promises whispered in candle-lit rooms. They find support not only among disaffected nobles, but also across the Channel, where French forces wait with patient eagerness. Edward, blind to the gathering storm, continues to cling to Despenser, as though loyalty to one man can outweigh the fury of an entire kingdom. You, standing in the great hall one evening, smell the heavy smoke of pitch torches and hear the faint echo of a storm outside, and you realize it is not the weather, it is history itself rumbling closer. Edward's reign has become a chessboard on which he has already lost too many pieces. Isabella and Mortimer move like queens and knights, swift and calculated, while Edward clutches pawns and insists he still has the upper hand. You almost want to whisper to him, to tell him that the story is already shifting without his permission. But Edward would not listen. He never did. The man who believed lust could be shield enough now finds that it has stripped him bare, and though the crown still sits on his head, it gleams more like a target than a trophy. The halls echo differently now, footsteps heavier, silences sharper. You walk through them and know in your bones that the final act is approaching. It is not here yet, but you can smell it, like iron in the air before a storm. And when that storm finally breaks, it does not come as a single bolt of lightning, but as sails appearing over the grey waters of the Channel, pale ghosts at first, then swelling into full sight with their proud crests and the hum of oars biting into the sea. You can almost hear the collective intake of breath along England's southern coast as villagers and messengers rush to spread the word. Isabella has returned, and she has not come alone. She glides across the water not as a queen hoping for reconciliation, but as a conqueror who has been biding her time. Her ships are filled with mercenaries, knights who have chosen coin and cause over loyalty to Edward, and at her side stands Roger Mortimer, tall, steady, the kind of man who seems to turn every glance into strategy. The wind whips their banners as if the very weather has taken their side, and though Edward remains in his castles, clutching his crown and his Despenser, you can feel the tide of history sliding against his feet, dragging him further from safety with each passing hour. The sound of hoofbeats, spreads faster than rain across a courtyard. Noble after noble begins to flock to Isabella's cause, men who once bowed stiffly to Edward, now loosening their allegiances with surprising ease. It is not only rebellion, it is relief. Relief to turn away from a king whose love for one man has poisoned his ability to rule. Relief to put their hopes in a queen whose calm fury seems somehow steadier than Edward's frantic smiles. You watch it unfold like water slipping through Edward's fingers. Castles open their gates without a fight, banners are lowered and raised again, and men who had once sworn their lives to the king now ride under Isabella's colours. There is a joke whispered in taverns that even the weather turned traitor, for the rains came heavy on Edward's roads, while Isabella's march stayed miraculously dry. You laugh softly at the image. Imagine a bedraggled king stuck in mud, while his wife strides forward on clear paths. But the humour carries the sting of truth. Edward is losing ground, not mile by mile, but heartbeat by heartbeat. Inside his halls, the tension becomes unbearable. Edward paces at night, muttering to Despenser, his hands trembling as he clutches parchments full of half-formed orders. Despenser urges harshness, vengeance, promises that cruelty can still salvage loyalty. You can almost see the desperation between them, two men wrapped in a shrinking circle, as though if they just hold each other tightly enough, the world will stop closing in. But it does not. Servants notice how few letters return with good news. Messengers arrive and do not bow as low as they once did. Even the guards glance sideways, calculating whether it is safer to remain loyal or to betray. Fear, once Edward's weapon, now gnaws at him instead. When Isabella's forces finally march inland, the countryside does not erupt into war. Instead, it sighs in surrender. Villagers bring bread and ale to her men, nobles bend their knees eagerly, and Edward finds that the kingdom he thought divinely his has quietly slipped away while he was feasting and jousting. He flees with Despenser, darting from stronghold to stronghold, trying to outrun not only his wife's army, but the weight of his own mistakes. You follow, the chill of damp stone clinging to your sleeves as Edward passes through dim castles, his footsteps echoing in corridors that feel less like homes and more like temporary shelters against the inevitable. Every door seems weaker, every guard less trustworthy. You wonder if he knows yet that his crown has already left his head, even though the circlet of gold still presses against his thinning hair. There is one night you remember most vividly, when Edward huddles in a small chamber lit only by a single candle. His face is hollow, shadows cutting deep around his eyes, and he whispers to Despenser of loyalty, of divine right, of God's protection. The candle sputters as if in mockery, and you realize how small his voice sounds compared to the vastness of the storm gathering outside. Historians sometimes wonder whether Edward ever admitted to himself that his downfall was tied to love, or if he clung to the illusion that it was only treachery and chance. The question remains unanswered, hanging like smoke above that flickering flame. By the time Isabella enters London, she does so with triumphant ease. Crowds cheer her name, children run beside her horse, and the bells of the city ring not for Edward's victories, but for her arrival. It is surreal to witness, a queen, once sidelined and humiliated, now welcomed as though she were a savior. She does not stride with arrogance, but with a measured calm, as if she has been rehearsing this moment for years. Mortimer rides beside her, his armor gleaming even in the smoggy air, his presence as steady as her own. Together they look like rulers already, and though Edward still breathes, still clutches his desperate Despenser, the kingdom has clearly chosen. You see Edward again when he is finally captured, a man worn down to threads. He is dragged not as a king, but as a prisoner, his robes muddied, his crown gone, his eyes darting with the wild fear of an animal caught in a trap. Despenser, ever loyal, stays close, though his face is grey with terror. The silence of the crowd as they are paraded through the streets is heavier than jeers would have been. No one needs to shout, no one needs to throw rotten fruit. The absence of respect is punishment enough. The fall of a king is loud in some ways, but in this moment it is deafeningly quiet, the hush of a kingdom already shifting its loyalty to new rulers. The punishment of Despenser becomes one of those grisly footnotes of history that you almost wish you could close your eyes against, though even softened for bedtime retelling it remains grotesque. He is condemned for his greed, his cruelty, and above all for his closeness to the king. His execution is staged not just as justice, but as theatre, a brutal performance meant to erase his influence forever. You watch Edward's face as it happens, pale, twisted, half mad with grief, and you cannot help but wonder if he finally realizes the price of a love that ignored all else. To hold Despenser so close was to paint a target on his own chest, and now that target has been struck. Edward himself is not killed outright, though many would have preferred it. Instead, he is forced to abdicate, to hand over his crown to his young son, a boy barely into his teens, wide-eyed and fragile beneath the weight of the ceremony. Imagine the bitterness of that moment. Edward, once the anointed king, now made to bow to his own child. You stand nearby and feel the air constrict, as though even the walls pity him. The crown passes not with thunder, but with trembling hands, and in that exchange the last thread of Edward's power snaps. He is no longer king, no longer even master of his fate, but a man reduced to waiting in castles that are not his, hoping that tomorrow will not bring worse news than today. The strange part, the part that still makes you tilt your head centuries later, is how swiftly the kingdom accepts this transfer. There is no great outcry for Edward's return, no loyalist army rising in his name. It is as if everyone has collectively exhaled, relieved that the storm has finally broken, ready to move on without him. The boy king is treated as a fresh start, Isabella and Mortimer as his guiding hands, and Edward himself is tucked away like a relic too embarrassing to display, but too sacred to destroy outright, at least for now. It is a fall both dramatic and oddly anticlimactic, the grand collapse of a king swallowed not by fire and steel, but by silence and resignation. And you, walking the dim corridors of his confinement, hear the echo of his footsteps, slower now, his laughter gone, his words fractured into prayers and mutterings. He is a man who once tried to build a kingdom out of affection, and ended up building his own cage. The irony is sharp enough to taste, though you let it dissolve on your tongue like a bitter herb, because the story is not yet finished. A king can be dethroned, but history is not content until the final curtain falls. And in Edward's case, that curtain will close in ways still debated, still whispered, still flickering between fact and legend. For now, though, you leave him pacing in his borrowed shadows, stripped of his crown, stripped of his Despenser, waiting for whatever end will be chosen for him. And it is in that waiting that the weight of his choices settles most heavily. For days stretch into weeks and weeks into months, and Edward is left with little but his own thoughts for company. The sound of dripping water in the corners of damp chambers becomes his music. The shuffle of guards in the corridor his only audience, and you cannot help but notice how thin he grows, how his once lively expressions dull into something vacant. For a man who once filled great halls with tournaments and laughter, the silence of captivity is its own kind of torture. He is shuffled from one location to another, first here, then there, as though his captors cannot quite decide what to do with him, but all the while the circle around him grows smaller, his influence shrinking until even his name is whispered only in past tense. Isabella and Mortimer, meanwhile, act with the confidence of rulers, though without the titles to match. They guide the young Edward III as though he were a marionette, strung carefully on their ambitions, every gesture shaped, every word rehearsed. The people of England, weary of instability, accept this arrangement with the kind of shrug that comes after too many years of chaos. Bread still bakes in ovens, markets still chatter with coins exchanging hands, and so long as life moves forward, many do not trouble themselves with whether the true king sits on the throne or wanders lost in his own downfall. You walk through these markets, feeling the warm crust of loaves, hearing the bleating of sheep, and you realize how distant Edward II already feels from their lives. Kings may fall, but the rhythm of everyday existence swallows their collapse with frightening efficiency. Still, the question of what to do with him lingers. A dethroned king is dangerous simply by existing. So long as Edward II breathes, there is always the chance that some ambitious noble might decide to rally around his name, paint themselves as restorers of divine order, and plunge the country back into war. Isabella and Mortimer know this, and you can sense their unease each time Edward is mentioned. Do they keep him alive and risk rebellion, or do they end his story more abruptly and risk martyrdom? It is a question that hangs in the air of their council chambers, drifting between tapestries and candle smoke. And though no one dares to put it bluntly at first, the tension makes the answer more and more inevitable. In his confinement, Edward is not entirely abandoned. There are guards, attendants, the occasional cleric who visits to offer prayers. Yet these small mercies do not soothe him. His mind wanders, his words sometimes spill into incoherence, and those who record his presence note that he often looked haunted, as though staring at things no one else could see. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps madness, perhaps just the crushing weight of solitude. Historians still debate how much of Edward's decline was psychological, how much was physical, and whether his captors allowed neglect to do the work that swords could not. You, standing in one of those chill stone chambers, feel the draft press against your skin, and you wonder how long a man could truly last with nothing but regret to warm him. Meanwhile, Despenser's fate still echoes in Edward's ears. The memory of that execution, that spectacle of cruelty, clings to him like smoke that will not wash out of his robes. He must have replayed it endlessly, the image of his beloved torn from him in the most public, humiliating way possible. To lose power is one thing. To lose it through the destruction of the person you loved most is another entirely. It is as if the world had gone out of its way to craft the cruelest possible punishment. You catch yourself thinking that Edward's tragedy was not simply that he fell, but that he fell with his heart still tethered to a man the world despised. To history, their love was a scandal. To Edward, it was the axis of his life. And now, he has been forced to live in the absence of it, like a star cut adrift from its orbit. There is a curious, almost tender irony in how the people speak of him during these months. Some call him a fool, others a tyrant, still others a victim of bad fortune. Few, if any, speak of him as a king anymore. He has already been reclassified, transformed in living memory into something smaller, something pitiable. His title may still cling to him in documents, but in the hearts of those who pass news from village to village, he is the former king, the poor man in captivity, the one who lost everything. You listen to these words traded over mugs of ale, hear the laughter that sometimes accompanies them, and you realize that Edward's reputation has been executed long before his body is. And yet, the story teeters here, balanced on uncertainty. What exactly happened in those final months remains a mystery still argued over in the pages of history. Some say Edward was treated well enough, allowed his comforts, given a measure of dignity. Others claim he was tormented, that his guards relished the chance to mock and starve him, stripping away not only his crown, but his humanity. The most notorious legend, that Edward was killed by the insertion of a red-hot poker, emerges from this fog of uncertainty, shocking enough to ensure it would be retold endlessly, questionable enough that historians continue to doubt it. Did it happen, or was it propaganda, a symbolic punishment invented to mark him as the king who died by the same lust that ruined him? You cannot help but smirk at how history loves irony, even when it must invent it. For Edward himself, the waiting must have been unbearable. Every creak of a door might have been his last warning, every glance from a guard a possible sign of impending death. Imagine the exhaustion of living each moment expecting an end, never knowing whether it would come by poison, by blade, or by neglect. He had lived his reign ignoring threats, blind to the patience of his enemies, and now his final days were spent consumed by them. The walls around him seemed to lean closer with each passing night, the draughts colder, the silence louder. You walk alongside him in those shadows, your footsteps soft, your breath visible in the damp air, and you realize that even without the violence of legend, this was already a form of death, a long, unraveling kind of dying. The kingdom beyond his cell moved on. Markets bustled, sermons rang from church pulpits, Isabella and Mortimer enjoyed their position, and the young Edward III grew quietly under their watch. It is almost cruel how quickly life can adjust to the absence of a king, how little disruption his fall caused once the crown was pried from his head. But perhaps that is the truest punishment of all, not to be killed in dramatic spectacle, but to be forgotten while still alive, to hear your own people no longer speak your name with reverence but with weary dismissal. Edward, who once believed love could be the core of rulership, was now reduced to the cautionary tale of how easily affection can unravel a kingdom. And though you know his end is close, though you can almost hear the murmurs of the guards who will one day report his final breath, the precise details slip into shadow. Did he die quietly, neglected in his chamber, whispering Despenser's name to stone walls? Did his captors smother him, strangle him, or, as the legend insists, inflict that grotesque punishment designed to brand him forever as a man consumed by lust? Historians argue, but the truth has long since dissolved in the silence of that cell. All that remains is the sense of inevitability, the knowledge that Edward II would never leave confinement alive. And as you stand in that darkness with him, listening to his breath grow shallow, you realize the tragedy is not only in how he died, but in how completely the world had already moved on without him. His body gone, his reign erased, his memory warped into whispers and legends that grow more elaborate with each telling. Outside the walls where Edward II breathed his last, the machinery of power does not pause to mourn. Isabella and Mortimer continue their hold, guiding the kingdom as though nothing monumental has just taken place. For the chroniclers, though, this is the moment when history's ink grows thickest as rumors spill into parchment. Was it murder? Was it mercy? Or was it simply the slow fade of a man unfit for the brutal demands of kingship? The uncertainty becomes the defining feature of Edward's end. His life was controversial, but his death becomes something stranger, a story half in shadow, half in theatre, shaped less by fact than by what others wanted to believe. It is here that you recognize how Edward's story begins to live a second life, no longer in flesh, but in narrative. And this narrative is fickle. To some, he is the tragic king undone by love. To others, he is a tyrant who wasted England's strength on his desires. And to many, he is a cautionary emblem, proof that kings who surrender to private obsession will lose the crown meant to be carried for public duty. You walk through abbeys where monks still whisper about him, past castles where his name is avoided as though cursed, and through markets where ballads exaggerate his end with lurid detail. Everywhere, Edward is alive again, but alive as a story, not as a man. The legend of the red-hot poker spreads quickly, perhaps too quickly to be trusted. It is grotesque, unforgettable, and perfectly symbolic. The king who gave himself to lust meeting death by a weapon of fire that mocked his passion. The people seize it eagerly because it makes sense to them. History, after all, does not always reward accuracy. It rewards resonance. The story resonates because it reduces Edward's complex life into one simple message: lust destroyed him. And so, whether or not it happened, the tale cements itself into chronicles and gossip alike, refusing to die for centuries. You stand in a tavern corner listening to a bard recite the account with theatrical gestures, and you see the wide-eyed faces of his audience, some shocked, some laughing, none doubting. In that moment, you realize Edward has been turned into entertainment. Yet even as England consumes this story, there are those who hesitate to believe it. Careful clerks note the lack of consistent detail, cautious scribes leave room for doubt, and more sympathetic voices argue that Edward may have been quietly smothered, poisoned, or simply left to waste away. They cannot prove it, but they sense that something is amiss, that the poker story is too convenient, too vivid, too neatly aligned with Edward's reputation. And so, centuries later, historians pore over these discrepancies, tugging at the threads of evidence, finding gaps, contradictions, and the unmistakable fingerprints of propaganda. For every lurid tale of his fiery death, there is a quieter suggestion that his passing may have been less theatrical but no less tragic. Meanwhile, the realm marches forward. Edward III, still young but growing sharper by the year, begins to feel the weight of his own position. Under Isabella and Mortimer's guidance, he learns the rituals of kingship. But in private, he must wrestle with the knowledge that his father's fate could easily be his own if he proves weak. Imagine the heaviness of that inheritance, a crown passed not in triumph but through betrayal. You can almost see the boy's watchful eyes, cataloguing every mistake of those around him, already promising himself he will not end like the man whose blood runs in his veins. The court may be focused on Isabella and Mortimer, but the boy king is quietly shaping into someone who will one day break their hold. And in this way, Edward II's death continues to echo, not through his reign, which ended in failure, but through the resolve it instills in his son. Every slight against Edward II, every mockery of his name, becomes fuel for Edward III's own ambitions. If a father can be remembered as the king who fell for lust, then a son must rise as the king who restores dignity. This is not forgiveness, it is replacement. Edward II is not rehabilitated but erased, overwritten by a successor who will cast a longer, prouder shadow. You walk in the coronation halls, where banners fly and trumpets announce Edward III's authority, and you notice how no one dares mention the fallen king. The silence itself is a form of burial, but beyond the pomp of politics, the ordinary people continue to retell Edward II's story in their own ways. In villages, he becomes a character in morality plays, a warning against indulgence. In churches, priests fold his tale into sermons, emphasizing the dangers of sin. In noble halls, he is a hushed cautionary example when young heirs stray too far into pleasure. His name becomes shorthand for downfall, and though centuries may pass, the pattern remains recognizable. A man too ruled by desire loses what he thought was secure. That lesson needs no proof, no parchment of evidence, no scholarly debate. It simply lingers, repeated wherever power meets temptation. What then is left of Edward II, the man? If you peel away the gossip, the scandal, the invented cruelty, you find fragments. A youth who loved music and tournaments, a husband mismatched with his wife, a ruler who leaned too heavily on the men he adored. He was flawed, yes, but also deeply human in ways kings were not expected to be. He sought intimacy in a world that demanded stoic duty. He desired companionship in a role that isolated him. He ruled with his heart when the throne demanded a spine of iron. And though history punishes him for these contradictions, you cannot help but feel a small thread of sympathy, walking once more in the echo of his chambers. He did not fit the mold of kingship, and so he was broken by it. As the years pass, Edward's story is buried deeper under the triumphs of his son. Edward III will wage wars, win victories, and claim glory, and the shadow of his father will seem ever smaller by comparison. Yet Edward II never vanishes entirely. His strange, scandalous death remains too striking to ignore, too delicious for storytellers to abandon. He drifts into ballads, chronicles, and eventually into plays and histories that thrive on drama. His failure, preserved through exaggeration, becomes his immortality. You realize as you listen to a later dramatist put words into his mouth that he never spoke, that Edward lives more vividly in legend than he ever did on the throne. And here lies the final twist. In trying to destroy him, his enemies may have given him a form of endurance. By turning his death into a grotesque spectacle, they ensured it would never be forgotten. By mocking his love, they made it unforgettable. By condemning him as the king who died from lust, they carved his memory into the very imagination of history. He is remembered not as he was, but as the story he became. And in the end, perhaps that is the cruelest fate of all, not to be erased, but to live forever in a form that you yourself would not recognize. You step back from the centuries, looking at the arc of his life. A boy who became king, a man who fell for love, a ruler who lost his crown, and a prisoner whose death still sparks debate. It is not a triumphant arc, nor a noble one, but it is undeniably human. Edward II's reign may have been a failure, but his story, strange, lurid, tragic, endures. And as you close your eyes, letting the past fade into the soft darkness of sleep, you realize that in the end he is still with us, not in power, not in glory, but in the enduring fascination of a tale too curious to let go. And yet even with Edward confined within the walls of Berkeley Castle, you sense that the story is not slowing but tightening, each hour pressing harder against him like the stone blocks of his prison. The echo of chains does not need to be heard for you to feel the weight of them, because by now Edward is bound far more by betrayal than by iron. The walls are thick, the doors locked, and the guards are no longer his own men but those of Isabella and Mortimer, whose rise has been built on his ruin. You move with him through the damp corridors, where the air tastes of mildew and resignation, and you cannot help but notice how sharply the grandeur of kingship has contracted into this narrow confinement. Not long ago, his presence filled vast halls, where banners trembled with color and courtiers bent low. Now his shadow flickers against slimy stone, a monarch reduced to a captive, clinging to what remains of dignity as the kingdom moves on without him. The countryside outside the castle whispers with rumors. Villagers speak in hushed tones at hearths, wondering if the king still breathes, wondering whether he deserves to. Some imagine him plotting revenge, though you see only a weary figure staring through the slit of a window at a patch of sky that never changes. It is a cruel irony, is it not, that the man whose desires once shaped the politics of England can no longer even decide when to close his eyes. The guards decide his meals, his waking, his sleep, and perhaps even the cadence of his heartbeat. Historians still argue whether Edward's jailers were merely stern or quietly sadistic, but you can picture both possibilities: the impassive delivery of bread and water, or the subtle cruelty of taunting him with tales from outside, where Isabella and Mortimer enjoy the power once his. If you lean into the scene, you might almost hear the crackle of a distant hearth fire, smell the tang of wet straw on the floor, and feel the itch of damp fabric against your skin. Edward likely felt all of that, and more. The shiver of isolation that no cloak could warm. The knowledge that those who once swore loyalty to him now raised their cups to his conquerors. The silence around him was not peace but punishment, as though every sound withheld was a reminder of voices he would never command again. You find yourself almost wanting to reach out and tell him a joke, to break that suffocating stillness. But then you remember that humor has long abandoned these halls. There is a debate, of course, about how Edward spent these final months. Some chronicles suggest he prayed incessantly, clinging to religion in the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. Others whisper that he raged in his cell, shouting curses that the stone walls swallowed whole. And still others imagine a king resigned, his once fiery lust now cooled into ashes, the spark of rebellion finally extinguished. Which of these is true? Historians still wonder, and perhaps they always will, because prisoners seldom leave behind their own accounts. What remains are fragments, words written by others, each tinged with bias, each bending Edward into the shape that suited their own story. You feel the castle itself participate in his undoing. The damp seeps into his bones, the drafts cut through his garments, and the persistent groaning of timber makes every night feel like a prelude to collapse. In the daytime, the cries of distant crows remind him that freedom still exists, only not for him. Sometimes the guards may have let him wander the courtyard under watch, the grey sky pressing down like a lid on a pot, left to simmer far too long. Did he look upward and imagine escape? Or did he see the clouds as confirmation that the heavens, too, had turned their gaze from him? These are the sorts of questions that hum gently at the edges of history, inviting you to linger even when no answer can be given. And then there is the matter of his death. Yes, the infamous story, the one that has outlived Edward himself by centuries, the tale so lurid it almost sounds designed for the whispers of taverns rather than the pens of chroniclers. The red-hot poker, they say, slid into his body as a punishment that mocked his lusts, a cruel jest turned into execution. It is an image that refuses to die, one that still startles even now. But pause here for a moment and consider. How likely is it that such a grisly device was actually used? Many historians doubt it, pointing instead to more mundane causes: suffocation, starvation, or even a secret assassination meant to leave no trace. The poker may simply be a legend, a grotesque flourish added later to satisfy the hunger of gossip. Yet the fact that it clings so tightly to Edward's memory says much about how his reign is remembered, not by victories, not by laws, but by scandal, by desire turned deadly. If you could step closer to that final night, you would not see torches blazing or villains cackling. You would probably see a small, dimly lit chamber, the stale air heavy enough to press against your chest. A few guards murmur outside the door, their voices indistinct, perhaps uneasy about what they have been ordered to do. Inside, Edward shifts on his pallet, his breath ragged, his body thinner than when he entered. He might be thinking of Gaveston or Despenser, or perhaps of Isabella, who once shared his throne and now holds the keys to his cell. He might be thinking of nothing at all, his mind fogged by exhaustion, his heart simply waiting for its final beat. You cannot know for certain, and that uncertainty is precisely what makes this moment feel both intimate and unreachable. What you do know is that by dawn the whispers spread, Edward is dead. Whether by cruel instrument or quiet suffocation, the king's story closes in that castle. His crown long gone, his body soon to follow into the earth. The guards say little, the villagers learn much, and the court in London suddenly breathes easier. Isabella and Mortimer step more confidently now, unburdened by the presence of the man they once dethroned. England adjusts, as it always does, to the changing of power, even if it means forgetting too quickly the man who once ruled it. And you, standing invisible in that damp corridor, realize how softly history sometimes ends, not with trumpets or fanfare, but with the steady drip of water against stone and the silence of a king's final breath. It is not the grandeur of coronation or the drama of battle, but something smaller, sadder, and in its way more human. The story you have followed from glittering courts to shadowy conspiracies now lies still, waiting only for the chroniclers to decide how it will be remembered. And yet even as Edward's death closed the chapter of his reign, the ripples of his life continued outward, touching everyone who had once orbited his crown, and you can feel them now as if you are standing in the hush that follows a storm. The castle corridors grow still, but beyond the walls the kingdom shifts, and you follow that current, because history never allows silence to last. Isabella and Mortimer, triumphant in their victory, step into the roles they carved out with such ruthless precision. For a while they bask in it. You can almost hear the clinking of goblets raised in toast, smell the roasted meats paraded through halls once closed to them, and sense the smugness that drips from every gesture. Yet power gained through betrayal is always restless, and you watch as England itself begins to squirm beneath their hands. The people, so quick to believe in Isabella's cause when she landed with her invasion fleet, now murmur about her closeness with Mortimer. Whispers curl like smoke in taverns. Is this alliance one of strategy or of passion? You know the answer, of course. It is both. And that mix, intoxicating at first, will prove dangerous. Mortimer, flushed with ambition, acts less like a noble ally and more like a shadow king, issuing orders in Edward III's name, as though he himself wore the crown. Isabella, once hailed as a savior from her husband's folly, finds herself caught between adoration and suspicion. For every noble who praises her, another raises an eyebrow at her audacity. You walk through these chambers of shifting loyalty, and it feels a little like wandering a theater backstage while the actors frantically swap costumes. Yesterday's villain now tries on the robes of a ruler. Yesterday's heroine rehearses lines she never expected to deliver. And in the wings, young Edward III waits, watching, learning. He is only a boy on the cusp of manhood, but the court already stirs with curiosity. Will he become his father's echo, weak and indulgent, or will he seize the chance to break free of every shadow that came before him? Historians, with their endless pens, still debate how much the boy saw, how much he understood, but you can imagine his sharp eyes flicking between his mother and Mortimer, storing away each look of arrogance, each whispered word of plotting, like stones collected in a pouch he will one day hurl back. The irony is heavy, is it not? Edward II fell partly because he trusted too much in favourites who overreached, and now Isabella leans on Mortimer with the same reckless confidence. It is almost comical, if it were not so tragic, like watching someone trip on the very rug they once mocked another for stumbling over. You feel the cycle tightening, the wheel of fortune creaking as it prepares to spin again. For now, Isabella and Mortimer rule in triumph. But triumph in England is always fragile, always a glass bauble held too tightly in eager hands. And then there is the memory of Edward himself, lingering like a draught through every hall. People cannot decide what to do with it. Some would rather forget, wiping clean the mess of his reign, while others cannot resist poking at it like a bruise. The tales of his favourites, of Gaveston's arrogance and Despenser's cruelty, continue to circulate, exaggerated with each retelling until they sound more like fables than facts. And the manner of Edward's death, that stubborn tale, refuses to fade, repeated with gleeful horror. embroidered with each passing year. You realize that in death, Edward has been transformed into something stranger than a man. He is a warning, a symbol, a story told to illustrate the dangers of lust, favoritism, or misplaced trust, depending on the teller's mood. You walk now through the years that follow, and you can sense the shift again. Mortimer, bold in his grasp, overplays his part. He collects titles like baubles, flaunts his influence, and forgets that young Edward III is no longer a boy, content to stand in the wings. In the flicker of torches you can see it. The boy becoming a king, the student sharpening his knife. One day, in a sudden turn, Mortimer will be seized, dragged before Parliament, and executed, while Isabella will be forced into quiet retirement. The wheel spins, the rug shifts, and history, with its sly smile, once again delivers its punchline. And what of Edward II, lying silent beneath the earth? His grave becomes a curiosity, a pilgrimage for some, a point of shame for others. Pilgrims kneel at Gloucester, murmuring prayers as though the flawed king has become a saintly martyr. Nobles scowl, shaking their heads at the foolishness. Historians, centuries later, will still scratch their chins, debating whether he truly died at Berkeley Castle, or whether some daring escape spirited him away into obscurity. Could Edward have lived out his final days in secret, nameless and forgotten? The possibility lingers, tantalizing and unresolved, like a candle guttering but never quite going out. As you drift with the story toward its close, you feel the echoes soften. The clamor of revolt, the clash of ambition, the rumors of scandal. All of it begins to dim, replaced by the steady hush of passing time. The torches go out one by one, the halls empty, the castles crumble, and the people who once gasped at gossip lie just as quietly as Edward does now. You realize that the tale you have walked through is not only about lust or betrayal, but about the strange fragility of power, how quickly it slips from fingers that once held it with confidence. It is about the ways people remember, and the ways they invent memory when facts are too plain to satisfy. It is, in the end, about how a king can be undone not only by enemies, but by his own desires, his own choices, his own blindness. And so the story folds itself closed. The noise fades, the colors blur, and you are left in that in-between space where history becomes a lullaby, equal parts strange and soothing. You can almost hear Edward's sigh echo through the ages, not triumphant, not despairing, just human, and that is enough to carry you into rest. Now let the story settle, like embers in a hearth glowing faintly after the flames have died. You have followed the rise and fall of a king, the whispers of scandal, the shifting loyalties of a kingdom, and yet here in the quiet after, none of it presses upon you. Instead, the air feels softer, slower, as though time itself has stretched out a hand to calm you. You do not need to hold the weight of the tale anymore. It can rest on the shelf of memory, while you allow your own body to rest where it is. Breathe deeply now. In through the nose, hold for a moment, and let the air flow gently out, carrying away the last flickers of thought. Again and again, with each breath a little slower, a little easier. Your shoulders loosen, your jaw unclenches, and your heartbeat finds a gentler rhythm. The story is behind you, and what remains is only the comfort of stillness. Picture yourself lying in a quiet chamber, not unlike those medieval rooms, but free of damp, free of shadows. The walls are safe, the air is warm, and a faint breeze hums like a lullaby just for you. Beyond the window, the night sky stretches wide, its stars like lanterns hung far away, steady and calm. You do not need to chase them, only to know they are there, keeping watch. Let your breath match their glow, steady, patient, timeless. With every exhale, you drift further into rest, the edges of the day softening, the noise of thought dissolving. The story has ended, but your peace continues, carrying you gently into sleep.